Happy Sabbath, everyone. Of course, it's not very happy for people in Ukraine. It's been in the news quite a bit lately for obvious reasons. But what's been very interesting, I think, to see is the degree to which people are suddenly trusting the media once again after 2 years of people recognizing increasingly so that they were outright lying to us about all kinds of COVID stuff. But there's nothing like war to get people to fall into lockstep and believe whatever they're told. I've seen journalists unquestioningly retweeting and sharing things that are completely wrong. I fell into this myself. I shared an image of the president of Ukraine who had like a what do you call it? Kind of a vest on, military vest, and people were glowingly sharing this. Look at this guy. This is leadership, and come to find out, it's an old image from last year. So it's very difficult when there's low information, and people are just sharing this stuff, and our media institutions are doing it too. And so there's a lot of propaganda going on. Of course, you have Russian state TV that is only publishing their side of things. It makes you then wonder on the flip side, when it's America that's aggressing, what American media is doing. We all look at Russia right now and how ridiculous that they're supporting Putin and the state and justifying what's going on and only pushing this narrative. And then you have to ask oh, well, how does that work when the tables are turned and America's initiating military action? It's an interesting question. But today's question that I want to get at is what does the Prince of Peace say about war? Because it's very easy to look at this topic and just have an opinion. It's very easy to be visceral, be emotional, be vengeful in a sense, and just say, oh, we got to stop Putin, or we got to stop terrorists, or we got to, whatever. And people have these opinions, but do we ever really turn to the scriptures and see what God has actually said about war? There is something I'm going to share in just a minute that I never heard, ever, growing up in the church. It was never discussed. With all the 9/11 stuff and the war in Iraq and before that and past wars and with all of the militaristic adventurism across the world, I had never once heard a teacher, I had never encountered a lesson, never heard over the pulpit this portion of the scriptures that I'm going to read that I think is literally God's law on war. It's exactly what God has said about war, and yet radio silence. We don't talk about it, we don't read it, and I'm just baffled. When I finally came across this and really pondered it and let it sink in, I'm like, how have we never really discussed this before? Why did no one teach me this? And I had read this scripture kind of casually or whatever as I would read through. It's in the Doctrine and Covenants. But it never really stuck, and I wasn't searching for it. I wasn't focusing on that topic. And so I had read it before, but I hadn't really gotten it when I was younger. And so I want to start with a story. And this story is of the early church. This was in 1833. Of course, by now the early church is formed. You've got a lot of revelations coming in. And a lot of the Mormons are starting to gather to Zion. It had been revealed to Joseph Smith that was going to be in Jackson County, Missouri. And so all these Mormons start flooding in. Pretty soon, they comprise around 2/3 of Jackson County. So how do you think that the local folks living there felt when all these Mormons that they didn't really understand who these people are, what they believe, they're hearing all kinds of crazy stories, all of a sudden these people start moving in, and now they comprise a majority of the county. So these people get really worried that, well, wait a minute, we're going to have a Mormon judge and a Mormon sheriff, and the Mormons are going to take over the schools and everything else. And so the locals were very concerned because of the political advantages by sheer population that the Mormons were starting to accumulate. There were some other minor concerns in there, the fact that Mormons opposed slavery and it was a slave state and all this, but that was not the main thing. The main thing was the political concern of the sheer numbers of Mormons and the fact that they were actively proselyting and that more were going to come. It was a problem that was just going to keep getting worse. So finally, in July of 1833, a mob formed, including people within, official government positions in the community. And so this mob organizes itself and gathers at the courthouse in Independence in Missouri. This was July 20th, 1833. And they demand that the Mormons leave. And so Joseph was away at the time. He wasn't there. And the local leaders of the church asked for 3 months to consider the requests of the mob. The mob said no. So then they asked for 10 days, the leaders did. Mob said no. The mob said you have 15 minutes to decide. And when the leaders of the church didn't accept the mob's demand, the mob started to destroy property. So they destroyed the printing press. The church had a newspaper called the Evening and the Morning Star, and which is really interesting to read if you ever go back and read some of these past issues and how they wrote and what they talked about. But they destroyed the printing office. They took the press. They destroyed W.W. Phelps's home. They destroyed other property. They tarred and feathered some of the leaders. Said all kinds of vulgar, horrible things. They were threatening worse things. And so this was really tragic. Just, I think 3 days later, there were like 500 people in a mob that came back to Independence, started threatening the Mormons, that said that we will rid Jackson County of the Mormons peaceably if we can, forcibly if we must. They, whipped people. Just, it was crazy, right? So if you're living there at the time, if you're one of these Mormons, you're terrified, as they were, and not just terrified, but they were angry. And so this was the context in which a revelation was given just a few weeks later, and that revelation is what is now Doctrine and Covenants, section 98. And the important point that I want to focus on first in Doctrine and Covenants 98 is one that you've probably heard before, but I don't think we hear it enough. So this is in verse 16. It says, "Therefore renounce war and proclaim peace, and seek diligently to turn the hearts of the children to their fathers and the hearts of the fathers to their children." Renounce war and proclaim peace. So I've shared this scripture a lot. I've used it a lot in my kind of anti-war, pro-peace, efforts or whatever. But not until I was pondering, talking about the topic for this little episode, did I really catch on to the first word in the verse. It says, "Therefore, renounce war and proclaim peace." That statement, or that commandment to renounce war and proclaim peace, is connected to what was said before. The therefore is kind of a follow through, right? I said something, so in order to do that thing, therefore renounce war and proclaim peace. So what does it say in the previous verse? Verse 15. "If you will not abide in my covenant, ye are not worthy of me." So God's saying, if you can't follow my covenant, if you can't do what I tell you to do, you're not worthy. Okay? If you want to be a covenant people, if you want to be worthy of me, you have to do what I say. Therefore, renounce war and proclaim peace. The two are inseparably connected. It's not, if it's convenient, renounce war and proclaim peace, or the circumstances permit, or it's like, no, this is a covenant issue. If you want to be worthy of me, you must renounce war and proclaim peace. Now, I'm gonna deviate from section 98 just for a moment to address something I didn't plan on addressing until it happened on Friday, when the First Presidency released their statement on armed conflict. And so this statement was released late Friday, and it says, "We're heartbroken and deeply concerned by the armed conflict now raging. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has members in each of the affected areas and throughout the world. Our minds and hearts have been turned toward them and all our brothers and sisters. We continue to pray for peace. We know that enduring peace can be found through Jesus Christ. He can calm and comfort our souls even in the midst of terrible conflicts. He taught us to love God and our neighbors." It concludes this way: "We pray that this armed conflict will end quickly, and that the controversies will end peacefully, and that peace will prevail among nations and within our own hearts. We plead with world leaders to seek for resolutions in peace." Seek for such resolutions in peace. Okay, so quick observation about this. Great, glad we got this statement, very important. I feel that it's incomplete. First, I think it's a little odd that they didn't even mention Russia and Ukraine. I saw a lot of people chirping on Twitter about this too, that it's a very kind of watered down statement, to not even use specific terms, the armed conflict now raging. Well, what does that mean? Why not directly address what's going on. I mean, you look at what the Pope has been doing and going to the embassy and being a little bit more direct. It's kind of an interesting observation. And so the fact that it doesn't even say we're concerned about the armed conflict now occurring in Ukraine is an interesting observation. As I've said on a previous episode, I think there's sometimes some strategic prudence in the institution of the church, not opposing the state too much, but that we ourselves have an individual obligation. So I think this is perhaps an element. I think the flip side, the counter argument to that would be, I know how these statements work. I mean, I don't know specifically for this one, but just in general with any large corporation and with the limited knowledge, but some knowledge I have about how this has worked in the church in the recent past, these statements are prepared by the PR department and by the government affairs folks and vetted with the lawyers, and then they draft something and then they send it to the leaders for review, and then the leaders may, edit things a little bit or run with it, as was prepared. And so this feels like a little bit of PR massaging, and I'll speak a little bit more about the PR stuff and the church's position on war in a little bit. But why I think this statement is incomplete is I feel like it is only half of what we are commanded to do. We just read in D&C 98:16, therefore, if we want to be a covenant people worthy of God, therefore, renounce war and proclaim peace. I feel like this statement does an okay job at proclaiming peace, that, peace comes through Jesus Christ, enduring peace, even amid, trials and problems. I think that's good. That's important. But where is the part renouncing war? I think that's absent, and for me personally, I think unfortunate. I think renouncing war is something that even the institution of the church is required to do. Certainly individuals as well, but I do think that if the institution is part of this covenant and to be worthy of God, it also needs to renounce war. Past first presidencies did this. I had the pleasure, some of you can find this on my blog, I think some of you will remember this. I uncovered or unearthed this first presidency memo like years ago. I had seen this quote floating around the internet, and only a tiny portion, and no one really had like the full context or the full letter. And so I got sick of, in fact, I had someone challenge me. They said, I think that quote is fake. And so I was like, I'm going to prove you wrong, because it was a good quote. Let me see if I can find it here. First presidency letter war. I'm going to Google on the fly while I'm talking. Here it is. A letter. The post is titled "A Letter to the Treasury from the LDS First Presidency in 1941." So if you Google that, you'll find my blog post. And so here's this quote that had circulated around the internet that I had seen, but no one could source. It said, "The church as a church does not believe in war. And yet since its organization, whenever war has come, we've done our part. We do thoroughly believe in building up our home defenses to the maximum extent necessary, but we do not believe that aggression should be carried on in the name and under the false cloak of defense. We therefore look with sorrowing eyes at the present use," 1941, "to which a great part of the funds being raised by taxes and by borrowing is being put. We believe that our real threat comes from within and not from without." I'm going to talk about that in a minute, and something insightful I think you'll find interesting. I'm going to repeat it right now, though. We believe that our real threat comes from within and not from without. And then it says, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so it continues. So I, doing some research up at the University of Utah, I don't even remember now. I was going through someone's letters. Was it Heber J. Grant? Man, it's been so long. It's been since 2009. No, it was it was like an archive of the Secretary of the Treasury, and Eccles. That's who it was. Eccles was the chairman of the Fed, and anyways, so I've got that all documented there. You can go look at. My point is that in the past, the church as an institution has been outspoken on war. And so to not do it in this first presidency statement, to me, is a missed opportunity. And I think our doctrine requires us to renounce war and to proclaim peace. Okay, but so what is this law of war? I'm going to get in a little bit later to the other things I mentioned, the PR issue, and this idea that our true threats come from within and not from without. But if you read the rest of Doctrine and Covenants section 98, you find something that we are awful at, and that is compliance with God's law of war. What does God actually say? For those of us who believe in modern revelation, what has Jesus actually said about um, war? Okay, so I'm going to start in verse 23. This is about 7 verses after the renounce war and proclaim peace. First, there's a section dealing with our families and more personal circumstances, and then there's a section dealing with war. So when it comes to our families being persecuted, being tarred and feathered, being, unjustly persecuted maybe by the government or, whatever, here's what it says in D&C 98:23. God says, I speak unto you concerning your families. If men will smite you or your families once, and you bear it patiently, and revile not against them. What does revile mean? It just means it's speech. It's being angry, being outspoken, criticizing. So revile is just speech. If you bear it patiently and revile not against them, neither seek revenge, which is action oriented, ye shall be rewarded. But if you bear it not patiently, it shall be accounted unto you, the smiting, the persecution, as being meted out as a just measure unto you. So if we don't bear it patiently, if we seek revenge, then what happened to us was just, according to God. And again, if your enemy shall smite you the second time, and you revile not against your enemy, and bear it patiently, your reward shall be 100-fold. And if he shall smite you a third time, and you bear it patiently, your reward shall be doubled unto you 4-fold. Okay, so here's what's interesting. So in verse 31, after this has happened 3 times, you've been persecuted a lot, they're attacking you a lot, things are happening. If you continue to bear it patiently and you're not seeking vengeance, right? In verse 30, it says, if you'll spare him, you'll be rewarded for righteousness, your children, your children's children, and everything else. Nevertheless, this is verse 31, thine enemy is in thine hands. And if thou rewardest him according to his works, in other words, an eye for an eye, if you will, thou art justified. If he's sought thy life, in other words, tried to kill you, and thy life is endangered by him, thine enemy is in thine hands, and thou art justified. But this requires us as individuals and families to suffer and not fight back, to bear it patiently, to not speak out negatively, to not seek revenge, but to bear these things. That's a very interesting thing for a lot of us who are very much kind of self-defense oriented and thinking that, if someone attacks me, I can defend myself. These verses challenge us to think a bit differently about that. It's kind of a turning of the other cheek thing maybe, or even loving our enemies. This is something more than we are used to, but it gets even more significant when we get into the section dealing with war. Before we get there, God then, after talking about our families, he says, I gave this law to Nephi, to Joseph, Jacob, Isaac, Abraham, and all mine ancient prophets and apostles. And again, this is the law that I gave to mine ancients, that they should not go out to battle against any nation unless I, the Lord, commanded them. This is something interesting because most Mormons are kind of Republican, and most Mormon Republicans are think of, I got this statement I pulled up from my friend Mitt Romney. And he had this quote back in 2012 when he was running for president. He's speaking at an audience and everyone's all abuzz, about Mormons and running for the president, Mitt Romney again and everything. Here's what Mitt Romney said. He said, of course you take out our enemies, wherever they are. The Taliban at the time, declared war on us. We go anywhere they are and we kill them. That's a very Republican thing to do. That's not a very Christian thing to do. That it's not at all consistent with what God here is saying, right? A law that they should not go out to battle against any nation, kindred, tongue, or people unless I, the Lord, commanded them. Okay, now here's where it gets interesting when it comes to God's law of war. This is something I think we can think about when it comes to Russia and Ukraine. We can think about this in the context of the supposed war on terror, right? And frankly, any war. So he says that if any nation, tongue, or people should proclaim war against them, this is the law he gave unto his ancients. So we'll talk about that in a minute, whether this has modern applications. So far, he's just said, this is a law that I gave unto, people historically. That if anyone should proclaim war against them, so this is different than your family being persecuted or attacked. This is if someone's, another country, another group of people is trying to attack you, that they, God's people, were required to first lift a standard of peace unto that people, nation, or tongue. And if they did not accept that offering of peace, neither the second time or the third time, then they bring these testimonies to the Lord. Then I, the Lord, would give unto them a commandment and justify them in going out to battle against that nation, tongue, or people. 3 times you're required to lift a standard of peace, right? This kind of live and let live, this, even if you're attacked or someone's threatening you, you lift a standard of peace, right? This is kind of anti-Nephi Lehi-ish a little bit. And only after the 3rd time does God justify us. That's a very important word. God doesn't command us to go out to war. He doesn't command us or say we're morally superior or anything. He justifies us, which means we're not held accountable. It's not a sin. It's not a mistake. Like, we're justified. It's okay if you do it, but there's still a higher opportunity to do. And then he says, if that's the case, I, the Lord, would fight their battles and their children's and their children's children. Okay, Connor, so that's fine. That's great. Back in the time of theocracy and back in the time of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, like God is saying, that's fine. God used to operate that way. That's not how he operates today. Except, then we read in verse 38, behold, this is an ensample unto all people, saith the Lord your God, for justification before me. This is an ensample, an example, a demonstration. This is the law. This is what you need to do for all people to be justified before me. So it goes on talking about the importance of forgiving our enemies who trespass against us and all the rest, right? That vengeance is the Lord's and everything else. But this is God's law of war. This doesn't say only if you live under a theocracy and, if the prophet is leading the military. It doesn't say only if you, lived 1,000 years ago. This is an ensample unto all people for justification. So you got your Mitt Romneys out there, and you got your John Bybes, and John Bybee was the judge who authorized waterboarding and torture during all of the Middle East stuff during the Bush years, and he's a Mormon. So here's this, Mormon judge responsible for this atrocity and getting the government to commit torture on these people. You've got Mormons at all levels of government who are more Republican or more statist than they are Christian. They're not at all, and many of our members, and you look at the polling and the support for war and everything else, like, we haven't talked about this as a church, I think, at all. When was the last time that a church leader pointed us to this scripture after 9/11 or, Afghanistan or Libya or Yemen or Syria or Ukraine or like any of these things and said, this is what God requires of us? This is significant, and it's entirely overlooked. It is God's law of war. If we want to be justified before him, this is what we are required to do. It's not enough to say, like I've been seeing all over social media, people who are in our church of my faith who are just talking in very pragmatic terms. Putin is a bully. Do we really want him having nuclear, power forever? Ukraine is the victim. We need to help them. We have the ability. We don't want to be the world's policeman, but isn't it our obligation to help? And all of these like utilitarian arguments that have no connection whatsoever to Christ's commandments. And look, if you want to be cognizant of that and say, oh yeah, I'm just doing the pragmatic thing, or I'm doing, what I think is reasonable or whatever. If you want to like set aside the doctrine, more power to you. But in my mind, it's an interesting idea here to analyze what God has actually said on the matter. If we want to be consistent disciples of Christ, I don't think we get to selectively choose which commandments we want to follow, especially on issues as significant as this one that entail matters of life and death. So that's God's law of war. It's an ensample unto all. Now, I shared this the other day that coming up in April, it's the 10th anniversary of when some friends and I, back in 2012, and this was right during what Mitt Romney just said. I think that was a few weeks before we did this. We put up a billboard featuring President Kimball's address on us being a warlike people. I'm going to read a brief excerpt because this was half a century ago. And so I think the question for us is, has it gotten any better? Are we any different? So this is what President Kimball said. He says, the Lord gave us a choice world and expects righteousness and obedience to his commandments in return. But when I review the performance of this people, us Mormons, in comparison with what is expected, I am appalled and frightened. Iniquity seems to abound. The destroyer seems to be taking full advantage of the time remaining to him in this, the great day of his power. Evil seems about to engulf us like a great wave. He says, in spite of our delight in defining ourselves as modern and our tendency to think we possess a sophistication that no people in the past ever had, in spite of these things, he says, we are, on the whole, an idolatrous people, a condition repugnant to the Lord. I'm going to do a whole episode, probably in a few weeks, about modern idolatry and what that looks like. So I'm going to continue for now. He says, we are an idolatrous people. We, the members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, are an idolatrous people. Half a century ago. Has it gotten any better? So here he continues. He says, we, us, not humans, not Americans, not Christians, we members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, I really don't like saying that, so long. We are a warlike people, easily distracted from our assignment of preparing for the coming of the Lord. Easily distracted. He says, when enemies rise up, we commit vast resources to the fabrication of gods of stone and steel, ships, planes, missiles, fortifications, and depend on them for protection and deliverance. When threatened, we become anti-enemy instead of pro-kingdom of God. We train a man in the art of war and call him a patriot. Thus, in the manner of Satan's counterfeit of true patriotism, perverting the Savior's teaching, which he then continues to say, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and all the rest. So half a century has gone by. I don't think we've gotten any better. I suggest we've gotten a lot worse. And that's problematic. Why? Well, think back to the story of the early church. I shared how the mob attacked the members of the early church in Jackson County in 1833. And there were a couple of attacks, and they were very nervous. A few years went by, right? They're moving around, and it was a few weeks after, in August of 1833, when they got that revelation. They were expelled in November. So July was the attack by the mob. August was the revelation. November, they were expelled from Jackson County. Well, it was a few months later, in February of 1834, that Zion's Camp was organized. You remember Zion's Camp, to go to Missouri from, I believe, Ohio, and help restore the saints to their property in Missouri. And just like a lot of the apostles thought that Jesus had come to be kind of this militaristic leader and to vanquish all their enemies, so too did a lot of the early church members think that Zion's Camp was this military effort to retake Jackson County by force. Of course, we know that wasn't true. You know the story of Zion's Camp. But what I want to share is D&C, Doctrine and Covenants, section 103, a portion of that revelation which occurred at the end of Zion's Camp. At the very end of section 103, it says, I say unto you, sue for peace, not only to the people that have smitten you, but also to all people, and lift up an ensign of peace, and make a proclamation of peace unto the ends of the earth, and make proposals for peace unto those who have smitten you, according to the voice of the Spirit which is in you, and all things shall work together for your good. Members of the church, more than anyone else, disciples of Christ, people who benefit from modern revelation, are supposed to be the best example of what God has commanded us to do. And yet, a century and a half later, you got Spencer W. Kimball saying, we're doing awful. We're idolatrous. We're wicked. We're easily distracted from peace. We instead become anti-enemy instead of pro-kingdom of God. We're not renouncing war and proclaiming peace. Sometimes we're feebly proclaiming peace and, oh, yay, we like peace. We want more of it, but we're not renouncing war. You can't really proclaim peace without actually renouncing war. And so this was 1834 that you had Zion's Camp. A few years goes by, lots of turmoil, lots of problems. And in summer of 1838, you've got all of these issues in Missouri still weighing on these church leaders. Sidney Rigdon stands up on July 4th to give this sermon. It starts out like a normal sermon. It's not that big of a deal. But he's in the public square in Far West. This is still in Missouri. So he gets up to give this speech. And he's talking about, it's July 4th after all, right? Independence Day. And he's talking about the noble principles of the founding of America and the founding fathers, and that they, the saints, were wanting to kind of take advantage of these rights. But then he says this is 1838, July 4th. So this is 5 years, almost to the day after that first mob attack in Jackson County. Sidney Rigdon says this: "We have proved the world with kindness. We have suffered their abuse without cause, with patience, and have endured without resentment until this day. But from this day and this hour, we will suffer it no more. That mob that comes on us to disturb us, it shall be between us and them a war of extermination. For we will follow them till the last drop of their blood is spilled, or else they will have to exterminate us. For we will carry the seat of war to their own houses and their own families, and one party or the other shall be utterly destroyed." 6 years later, Jedediah Grant, he was one of the apostles, he reflected on that speech, because a lot happened between 1838 and 6 years later. And it was his observation. Here's a quote from him. He says that speech was the main reason that fanned into a flame the burning wrath of the mobocratic portion, the mob of Missourians. They now had an excuse. Their former threats were renewed and soon executed, and we were then all made accountable for the acts of one man. Sidney Rigdon's inability to do what God had said, to threaten violence, to not renounce war and proclaim peace, ended up fomenting things to such a degree that led to the assassinations and and everything that followed. Brigham Young also placed blame for the church's troubles on Sidney Rigdon's speech. He says, "Elder Rigdon was the prime cause of our troubles in Missouri by his 4th of July oration." And so just in the few weeks following the speech, a couple months, there were 6 significant conflicts that had broken out between the Mormons and the Missourians. And then it was by October of the same year, so just a couple months after the speech, that Governor Boggs issued his extermination order against the Mormons for having made war upon the people of the state. What's very ironic about that is that in the extermination order that we're all familiar with, he says that the Mormons were ordered to be exterminated or driven from the state. Why? For the public peace. So here's the governor receiving intelligence that the Mormons, Sidney Rigdon, and others who were emboldened by him, were threatening violence. Were threatening to go hunt down the families of these people. And so he's getting this intelligence. He issues his extermination order, and he's doing it for the public peace, to exterminate the very people who were supposed to be proclaiming peace. Very ironic. Very ironic. Okay, so we've talked about God's law of war, and we've talked about some modern historical examples. One of the things that I think is very important to talk about is there's a scripture in the Doctrine and Covenants where God tells the saints, you hear of war in faraway lands, but you don't know the hearts of men in your own land. And this I found is very interesting, because the early saints were always fixated on the signs of the times and the second coming, and always kind of thinking about it, talking about it, and so they're fixated on all these big kind of global patterns. And to some degree, I think there's a lot of people who do that today. But here's God saying, you don't know the hearts of men in your own land. And you look at this Sidney Rigdon and the mob and the Jackson County, all these people, it's like you're fixated on these broader issues, but you're not doing a good job at a local level in this interpersonal interaction with other people. You don't understand. We talked on a previous episode about the word of wisdom, D&C 89, and it talks about, in consequence of the evil designs in the hearts of men, we give you this word of wisdom, right? There are people with these evil tendencies and ulterior motives and people trying to take advantage. And one thing that's very interesting here is, the Book of Mormon was written for our day. In fact, we are under condemnation still today because we have treated lightly the things that we've received. President Benson just a few decades ago said, we're still under that condemnation. We're not going to receive more until we've used what we have. And I always find it interesting when I'm in Sunday school and people are suffering through the war chapters of Alma. I mean, to some people, I feel like it's almost as bad as Second Nephi and the Isaiah chapters, except that you get that kind of pseudo patriotic, group, and Alma is like, yeah, stick it to the Lamanites and Captain Moroni and all these things. And I think a lot of these people completely miss why we have these war chapters and what the true message is. When we're talking about justified war, when we're talking about what does God approve of, we often will look at a conflict and say, well, there's a victim and there's an aggressor. So clearly we should go help the victim. And clearly the aggressor is wrong. And we blame the aggressor without looking at the context behind what's happening. We see that right now with Russia and Ukraine. Everyone is saying, oh, here's Ukraine and they're the victim, without having any clue about kind of the geopolitical intrigues that have been happening in recent months and years, America's involvement in them, and all these types of things. They just look with this like myopic tunnel vision at, oh my gosh, there's conflict. There's someone invading another country. And then I'm like, the United States has invaded other countries too. Were you as, upset back then? Well, maybe not, because those people had brown skin, but that's a topic for another day. People are, I think, totally inconsistent. The point I'm bringing up is that we have to not look so myopically at what is happening. We have to not look at the war chapters in the Book of Mormon and think that they're just this diary of, destruction and warfare, and then we move on without any spiritual lessons to be received from them. President Hinckley had this great quote where he says, the Book of Mormon is more inspired and inspiring than the Mormon newspaper, right? This idea that it was written for our day. So then why? Why do we have all of this war in the Book of Mormon? What is the point? Well, in my mind, the point is that if you look at all of those wars from the time that the people were able to rule themselves, because you had the kings, right? You had Benjamin and Mosiah, and then you had the judges. Now people could rule themselves. They were no longer under monarchy. They had some level of autonomy. And so from that point until Christ came again, until he came to the Americas, there were 15 wars that we have recorded in the Book of Mormon. There may have been others that either weren't recorded by, the authors of the record at the time, or that weren't included in Mormon's kind of, review or summary of everything else. But we have recorded 15 wars in the Book of Mormon. And what's very interesting from that time period, what's very interesting about that is that we look at that, the way it was explained to me when I was young, is it's the Nephites versus the Lamanites. And even though they, were wicked sometimes, generally speaking, the Nephites were the good guys and the Lamanites were the bad guys. And so it's very easy to see like all these wars, the Lamanites are being stupid and they're doing all these things wrong. Where's the spiritual application in that, other than just encouraging tribalism, right? Like, the good guys are always right. Therefore, when we see bad guys all over the world and, Al-Qaeda and, Mossad, what was the guy's name in Syria? I was just trying to say his name and I can't remember, but, and Putin and all these people, Saddam Hussein, good guys versus bad guys, just like the Nephites had to go fight the Lamanites sometime, is that what we're to take from the Book of Mormon? Well, not at all. Not in any way, because all 15 of these wars involved Nephites dissenting, fomenting the Lamanites into war, and using them as puppets. It was all internal problems. So when we read that portion of the First Presidency letter from 1941, talking about that our true problems are within and not from without, you begin to look at the Book of Mormon a little bit differently and realize that in every single one of these wars, it was a war from within. It was God's people, some of them breaking off, becoming wicked, having evil designs, and then wrongly providing misinformation to the Lamanites and inciting them to anger against the Nephites. It was all from within. It was people who knew how the Nephites operated, knew how, God's law worked there in that society, knew what to say, knew what arguments to make, and manipulated the Lamanites as pawns. That, in my mind, has modern application and spiritual relevance for those of us who have received the Book of Mormon as a modern way of gaining understanding of what's happening, why two entire societies, fell, the Jaredite and the Nephite nation. If we're to learn from these things so as not to repeat them, suddenly the war chapter is not about like, oh, we got to go, fight bad guys. It's like, well, wait a minute. There are people from within who are intentionally uh, getting people elsewhere in the world angry about us, intentionally creating attacks, providing them misinformation, who are doing false flag events and starting wars for their own purposes. Because why? Why did these wars happen? It's because the people instigating them, the former Nephites, they wanted power. They wanted to be in charge of the government. They wanted to consolidate power. They benefited from the conflict. That has application to our day. That has relevance to say, oh, wait, is that happening right now? Does that happen today? Right? Dwight D. Eisenhower warned everyone of the military-industrial complex and was terrified when someone would be in the seat of president that had not been involved in war and knew its brutality and its destruction, and who would just support this entire industry. There's a fantastic documentary that I've often recommended people watch from about a decade ago called Why We Fight by Eugene Jarecki. If you can find that on the internet, I think it's on Vimeo or YouTube or something. Go watch Why We Fight. It talks all about this. But that is the issue. For those of us who care about war, we have to say, well, whoa, wait a minute. What we see at a surface level is probably wrong. Because what we read in the Book of Mormon at a surface level is, I think, wrong. Nephites versus Lamanites, go, duke it out. Good guys versus the bad. Like, no, that's not what's going on. There's like chess. It's another degree. It's a meta, thing going on. You have to peel back the layers and understand what's actually happening. And that is why things are so problematic, I think, right now with Russia and Ukraine, is all the war propaganda and the crap journalism and people just believing what they're told from a media that they distrusted, 99% the other day. Now they believe 99% and they're swallowing whatever they're being told without understanding the kind of machinations behind the scene. And so we're to learn from the Book of Mormon, I think, that there's something more going on than just what is at the surface level. And we have to be extremely cautious about what we believe is accurate. And I mean, because you remember from reading the Book of Mormon, some of these stories, people were completely duped. Oh, the king's servants killed him, and like all these things, right? And it was false flags, and it was conspiracy, and it was subterfuge, and it was smoke screens, and all these things we read about. And I always find it fascinating that people will admit and concede that there were conspiracies in the past, sure, in the Book of Mormon, or, decades ago when, the CIA tried to, or when if you ever want to Google something interesting, go look up Operation Northwoods, right? Here, literally, this was the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the top military brass in the United States of America, sworn oath and everything to protect people, uphold the Constitution, and they presented a proposal to the President of the United States in which they suggested the military killing Americans, bombing American cities, downing boats of people off of Florida, and blaming it all on Cuba, so as to create pretext whereby the public, American public, would be incensed at Cuba and support going to war. This was during the whole Cuban, missile crisis and all that era. The only reason why this never happened is because JFK, who was the president, shot down the idea. But the military brass, confidentially, this only was declassified a little while back, confidentially was suggesting killing Americans in a false flag event and blaming it on another country so as to dupe Americans into going to war. Oh, but no, that happened decades ago. That doesn't happen today. We're not in the middle of that. That we've learned. As President Kimball said, we think ourselves so sophisticated and modern. Give me a break. If anything is sophisticated, it's the level and degree of propaganda with social media and deep fakes and editing and all the rest, right? If anything has become more sophisticated, it's the degree to which we can probably be duped into believing the wrong things. God is telling us in the Book of Mormon, it's the inward vessel. You have to cleanse the inward vessel. It is not the enemy from without, it is the enemy within. And so for those of us asking, does God approve of war and when and under what circumstances, we have to say, well, wait a minute. If we're going to make any informed decision about what is actually happening, we have to know what is actually happening. The other thing I want to briefly touch on is when it comes to the Book of Mormon is this idea of preventive war. I've seen, especially during the War on Terror years, so many members of our church arguing, as Mitt Romney did. I just read his quote about, we go over wherever they are and we go kill them. Right? That's preventive war. It's either vengeance, where you're trying to get back at them for something they did, or it's preventive war, thinking that, well, in the future they may someday, attack Americans, so we need to take the war to them and go kill them. The Book of Mormon is extremely emphatic in completely rejecting that in two places in particular. The one is in 3rd Nephi 3, when you've got Gidgiddoni. This is after there's let's see. This is 3rd Nephi 3. The Gadiantons are kind of infesting the land. Laconius is the leader of the Nephites. You've got Gidgiddoni. And in verse 20, so this is 3rd Nephi 3, it says, the people, the Nephites, said unto Gidgiddoni, pray unto the Lord, and let us go up upon the mountains and into the wilderness, that we may fall upon the Gadianton robbers and destroy them in their own lands. They're asking for the Mitt Romney foreign policy. Talk to God. Let us do what Mitt Romney has suggested that we all do. Verse 21, but Gidgiddoni saith unto them, the Lord forbid. For if we should go up against them, the Lord would deliver us into their hands. Therefore, we will prepare ourselves in the center of our lands, and we will gather all our armies together, and we will not go up against them, but we will wait till they shall come against us. Therefore, as the Lord liveth, if we do this, he will deliver them into our hands. So he's completely saying no to preventive war. He's saying God does not approve of this. We're not doing that at all. And yet we have people today, members of our faith, who just disregard Scripture. It's like they compartmentalize it. I'll proclaim peace superficially and say that I think peace is important, but I'm not going to renounce war. In fact, I'm going to seek vengeance and preventive war and they just completely disregard what God has said. The other example in the Book of Mormon is in Mormon chapter 3. And by this point, there's been like 35 years of war, and then there was a decade of peace. And so in verse 11, now you've got things starting up again, and you've got all this conflict. So this is Mormon, for whom the Book of Mormon was named. So this is in the Book of Mormon within the Book of Mormon. So Mormon chapter 3. And here he is, kind of the military leader of his people. You remember he was very young and very kind of smart and strong, and so he was appointed as the military leader. Okay, so verse 10. The people did swear by the heavens and also by the throne of God that they would go up to battle against their enemies and would cut them off from the face of the land. So what did Mormon do? Next verse. I, Mormon, did utterly refuse from this time forth to be a commander and a leader of this people because of their wickedness and their abomination. And just a few verses later, here's the voice of the Lord came unto me saying, vengeance is mine, and I will repay. And because this people repented not after I delivered them, behold, they shall be cut off from the face of the earth. No preventive war. At no point does the Book of Mormon or modern Revelation support this idea. And yet I see so many members of the church, especially during the War on Terror years and certainly since, talking about needing to go after people. And as Mitt Romney just said, you go where they are and you find them and you kill them. Or people saying, we ought to go to Ukraine and fight, Putin, and we got to send soldiers and resources and bombs and everything else. And it's completely inconsistent with what we find in the Scriptures. So how can we claim to be following God if we don't actually follow God? That to me is the oddest thing about all of this. The thing I want to end with here is, I think I might have shared this briefly in the past. So we got President Nelson now, who's the leader of the church. And shortly after, this was, I think, the 9/11 talks, or it might have been when the war I think it was right after the war in Afghanistan started. He gave a talk titled Blessed Are the Peacemakers. So he was not president of the church at the time. He was an apostle at the time. And so he gives this speech, and it's a really good address. I really liked it a lot. This was in October of 2002. So this is not quite the 1-year anniversary of 9/11. Of course, they're going into Iraq and Afghanistan. All this stuff is starting to take off. And President Nelson has a lot of really good stuff in here. He reminds us that God has commanded us to renounce war and proclaim peace. He tells us we need to follow after the things which make for peace. He says that we should live by the golden rule. He talks about how the golden rule is not just for individuals, it's for institutions as well, and even governments, which I think is a very important point. That is the point that Ron Paul got booed on stage about. And you remember this in the South Carolina debate in 2012. I think Mitt Romney was sharing the stage with him. And here's Ron Paul talking about the importance of treating other countries like we would want them to treat us, literally saying what what President Nelson had said a decade prior, and Ron Paul was widely booed by all these Christian conservatives in South Carolina. So this address by President Nelson is really good. So then the Associated Press comes along, and they publish a report saying the Mormon Church had issued a strong anti-war message, clearly referring to hostilities in the Middle East. And you could argue that it was an anti-war message. A pro-peace message is inherently an anti-war message. And yet you may also recall, if you're old enough, that at that time, the war fervor is crazy. What happens when, like even right now it's happening with Russia and Ukraine. The people who say no conflict, no involvement, no military, no soldiers, no bombs, no nothing, are decried as, traitors, as unpatriotic. It was intense following 9/11 when there had been this attack on American soil. It's less intense when it's happening somewhere else in the world. But you remember the hysteria that existed at the time. And so to call this an anti-war speech was basically saying that Mormons are, unpatriotic and traitorous and all these things. One newspaper claimed that Elder Nelson had railed against war, which is really hard to imagine a kind of nice elderly guy like that railing against anything. He didn't have a shred of contention in his remarks at all. So the church was quick to respond. The PR department kind of kicked into overdrive when this happened. And so one day after the conference ended, the October 2002 General Conference, the church's PR division issued a media advisory, and they stated that some news outlets had, quote, misinterpreted Elder Nelson's address, and they encouraged reporters and editors to consider the full text. So then the advisory emphasized a small portion of the text where Elder Nelson talked about urging that the church urges its members to fully render loyalty to their country. I actually quibble with this a little bit. If you've read Christ versus Caesar that I wrote a year ago, I explain how I think that's a little bit problematic about loyalty to country over loyalty to God. But this was like a tiny, tiny part of Elder Nelson's otherwise, I think, amazing address all about anti-war, pro-peace. And so here's the church's PR division completely setting all of that aside and say, oh, but look, here's this one line where Elder Nelson said that we urge our members to fully render loyalty to their country, including military service. But the address, it condemns wars of aggression. It justifies war in cases of legitimate self-defense, but always talking about in his address that peace is optimal, peace is possible, we should strive for it. Elder Nelson said, we cannot fully love God without loving our neighbor, and we cannot fully love our neighbor without loving God. Of course, any Christian should understand that, the greatest commandments. So then the Associated Press issues a follow-up after the church's PR division sends out this advisory. And the follow-up report from the Associated Press was titled, Mormons Back Bush Middle East Policy. Then they explained that the church had, quote, qualified Elder Nelson's remarks and, quote, offered support for President Bush's policy in the Middle East in the form of an editorial in the church-owned Deseret News, which came out a few days later. And here's what's mind-boggling. You think of Sidney Rigdon, who, just a few years after this new revelation is given, God's law on war, and he would know about it. It's not like he could plead ignorance or anything. So just a few years later, he completely abandons it and starts advocating for this conflict, which then fomented the problem. And according to Jedediah Grant and Brigham Young, was the incident that really exploded things that led to the extermination order and all these problems, right? So here's Sidney Rigdon completely ignore it. Well, here's the Deseret News editorial board completely ignoring the substance of Elder Nelson's remarks in the editorial. Just a few days later, this isn't 5 years later like Sidney Rigdon. Maybe he can claim that he forgot that it had been so years. This is not 5 days later. The church's paper says, and I quote, Saddam Hussein and the threat he represents to the United States and her allies will not go away on his own. This time, the nation may well have to strike first. The editorial concluded, Americans have known they must face Saddam again sooner or later. It appears the time has come. What the hell? Like, how do you go from General Conference, where Elder Nelson is talking about the Golden Rule, pursuing peace, condemning wars of aggression, the Book of Mormon is totally against preventive war and all the rest, and here you say This time, the nation may well have to strike first. I remember, who was it? I think Mike Lee, Senator Mike Lee, got flack a year or two ago for suggesting that the church should stop owning KSL and Deseret News. I happen to agree with that. Frankly, I think they should go further and get out of the higher education business with BYU and other things. But my gosh, and of course, why? Because then you look at an editorial like that and you say, well, wait a minute, is that the church's official position? And they blur the lines because historically in decades past, the leaders of the church would use the Deseret News editorial process as a way to kind of speak out and push their views. And it's unclear to what degree that happens today or was happening 20 years ago. But the presumption is that the church's editorial paper would never deviate from what the church as a position would want to do, because it is who they are owned by. And so what are we to make of that? That the PR department completely walked back the substance of Elder Nelson's remarks, which were about war and what God has said about war in the midst of going to war. What a more important time can there be to be talking about what God has revealed on the topic when we're in the middle of a discussion about whether to go to war? So it was a perfectly timed and appropriate address, and yet the PR department walked it back and said, oh, but look, he said we should be loyal to our government, which was then interpreted by the media to say, oh, they completely back President Bush. They're going to be loyal. They'll be good, citizens and go fight and do whatever they're told by Caesar. Oh my gosh, totally bungled opportunity. I mean, I 20 years later, and I'm still horrified at how this was handled. But I'm more horrified, I think, by the degree to which we ignore what is in section 98. I don't see much renouncing of war. Now, what does renounce mean? You go look at your 1828 dictionary and the Noah Webster dictionary, which is a fantastic treasure of information to understand what was meant by these words at the time. So you look up renounce, and the definitions, there's a few, tend to be more around a kind of verbal renunciation, a declaration, right? I renounce, my rights. I renounce my membership in this organization. I renounce war, right? So I think it can be fairly argued that renouncing war does not necessarily require being like actively anti-war, like fighting war and, critiquing war. I mean, maybe, right? So maybe it's just like, oh no, we shouldn't go to war. Let's instead, have peace. So maybe you can say that we're discharging our duties and abiding by the covenant to be worthy of God by renouncing war and proclaiming peace. If all we're doing when it comes to renouncing war is just, talking about how we don't support war, or that this God's law of war is what we need to do. But I think there is room in those definitions for a more active renunciation. In fact, I think this is what's required, especially in light of what we read in the Book of Mormon and the war propaganda and the conspiracies and the Nephites and Jaredites falling in large part because of these issues, the righteous being seduced into partaking in all of these things with the Gadiantons, the fact that this is happening in a modern era, that we're idolatrous, according to President Kimball, that we have not read and applied the Book of Mormon and are still under the condemnation, according to President Benson, right? That we rely on the arm of flesh, that we're not pro-kingdom of God, we're anti-enemy instead. All of these things leads me to conclude that we need to be more vocal in renouncing war. That we can't have this bland, like, oh, I don't support war, but if it comes to it, we need to, or if a country needs our help, the blandness is the problem. The apathy with which we, as a membership of the church, treat the topic of war is disgusting to me. As much, I don't know how to compare the two, but abortion and war, killing. And where are we? Why are we not more vocal? Why are we not speaking out? Why are we not renouncing these things? Sure, some people can renounce softly and calmly and quietly and whatever. But I think it's all kind of not pointless, but unproductive if we don't have more active renunciation. If we do not stand up and be anti-war, how can we demonstrate we are truly pro-peace unless we crystal clear renounce war? If we never articulate which wars we oppose, then how does anyone understand what we actually believe? If we issue statements that don't even mention Ukraine and Russia and just talk about armed conflict in these times, how can members of the church come to better understand what is right and what is wrong? If we don't draw lines in the sand, then everything's awash, and we have no demarcation to help us identify when we're doing something correctly and when we're not doing something well or at all. I think we need lines in the sand. I think the scriptures provide them. I think renouncing war requires clarity. It requires calling out wars that are wrong. It requires being vocal about what is wrong, if for nothing else, to help alert other people to that fact. When I go up to the Capitol and I testify or I speak in the media about a bill we're working on, for example, I don't necessarily think I'm going to persuade the people I'm speaking to. That's rarely why I do it. A strong reason why I do it is to educate everyone else listening who is not in the thick of all these conversations. There's a substantial educational benefit that comes from speaking out. And sure, maybe, we'll persuade the people we're trying to persuade, but at a minimum, we can wake a whole lot of other people up. But if we don't call things out for what they are, if we're not clear about what the problems are, no one's really going to get it. Everyone's going to nod their head in Sunday school. Yeah, peace is important. Yeah, we need more peace. Yeah. But they're never going to apply it to any particular situation because we've never helped them. We've never encouraged them to identify specific applications when those principles must be applied. What is the point of the principles if we're never acutely applying them to particular circumstances? And we might say, well, that's on us. We got to figure it out. But my gosh, we're doing a horrible job, And so maybe it's not the institution, maybe it's not the leaders of the church, but at a minimum, it better be some of us speaking out and renouncing war and writing op-eds or writing books or doing videos or holding town halls or I don't know what, doing TikTok videos, whatever floats your boat. But if we don't use our faith to encourage our fellow Christians and members of our church in particular to renounce war, then I think our words about proclaiming peace are a little hollower than they ought to be. I love seeing the leaders of our church and members of my church and other people proclaiming peace. We need it. We need a lot more of it. But it's the equivalent of thoughts and prayers. It just doesn't feel substantive, right? A lot of times. We need something more substantive. And I think that if we want to be followers of the Prince of Peace, we need to be more clear about what we oppose. If we stand for something, we have to be clear about what we stand against. That's where I think we as a membership have a lot of work to do. And it's hard to do it because you get swept up in the war propaganda and you see these stories coming out and, oh, look, the president of Ukraine looks like an amazing leader from this photo that ended up being a year ago. And here's this story of these 13 people on the island that told the Russian warship to go F off. And that went viral around social media. Oh, turns out that wasn't true either, right? You get all this misinformation, this propaganda, and people get swept up in these patriotic tribal feelings and completely relying upon the arm of flesh and forgetting God. God has said vengeance is his. God has said he will deliver us. God has clearly delineated the conditions in which we are justified in war. I can't remember the last time we even attempted to do what the scriptures say that we are required to do if we as a people want to be involved in and support war. Maybe we ought to listen. Maybe. We'll leave it there. Happy Sunday, everyone. See you next week.